morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at CIGI for this conversation on China and the global economy with China's ambassador to Canada, His Excellency Cong Peiwu. The event is organized in 4 sections, actually. We have a preliminary in which the ambassador will make some opening remarks of no more than 5 or 7 minutes. He and I will then engage in a conversation on sort of the key themes that we think belong in this topic for about half an hour, 40 minutes or so, and leave about that much time for a Q&A with all of you. And so please do send in your questions on the chat function, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can during this event. And then we will end with a few minutes of summative comments from the ambassador and myself. Ambassador Cong is a career diplomat who has spent, in fact, most of his career working on North American issues. He did a stint in Ottawa in the early 2000s, almost 20 years ago, but also has spent time in the UK. And so who better to help us think through and understand China's place in the global economy than the ambassador. And I say that because since about the early 1980s, there has been a relentless economic growth in China that has led to both prosperity and the things good and bad that go with it, and concomitant with that, China's increasing role in the global economy. And by almost every metric there is, China is now effectively the number 2, sometimes number 3 leader in various aspects of the global economy. I should also say, and this is coincidental, that although China has been a member of many international organizations for a good long time, in some cases since 1945, since Bretton Woods, it acceded to the WTO almost 20 years ago today, December 11, in fact, 2001. And that is often seen as a sort of inflection point in China's association or interactions with the global economy. And so we certainly have those issues to talk through as well. And so without further ado, welcome, Ambassador, to CIGI, virtually in this case, but eventually we hope in person. And over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. President Medhora, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to attend today's conversation. First, I would like to thank Center for International Governance Innovation for hosting today's event. And as a renowned think tank, CIGI's commitment over the past 20 years to offering innovative solutions to global issues is well recognized. Today's dialogue session falls on an opportune moment because this year marks the 50th anniversary of the lawful seat restoration of the People's Republic of China in the United Nations, and as the President mentioned, the 20th anniversary of China's accession to the WTO. The event is of significance as it not only focuses on China's opinions and contributions to global governance, but also covers the current focus of all sides. To understand China's role in today's world, I think it is important to view China's development from an objective perspective. Just as you should firstly find the key to unlock something, you should grasp the core to understand China. China upholds the socialism with Chinese characteristics, and its defining feature is the leadership by the Communist Party of China. Recently, we convened the 6th plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee. It is a useful material for learning about China, as well as the CPC, for it reviewed the party's magnificent history in the past century. Here, I want to share some views with you. The plenary session emphasized the principle of putting the people first. The original aspiration of the mission of CPC is to seek happiness for the Chinese people and the great rejuvenation of the nation. Since reform and opening up, we have eliminated extreme poverty for the first time in China's thousands years of history, with 770 million rural impoverished population lifted out of poverty. It is an important contribution to the cause of global poverty alleviation. We have blazed a path of whole process people's democracy. China's democracy is deeply rooted in Chinese history and culture, suited to its national conditions and supported by the Chinese people. The Harvard Kennedy School's service in China, which extended 13 years, suggests that over 93% of the Chinese people are satisfied with the central government, which is led by the CPC. The judgment on whether a country is democratic or not should be made by its people. We have noted that lately, the United States is busy about the so-called Summit for Democracy, which is in essence labeling and politicizing democracy and doing anti-democracy deeds under the banner of democracy. The plenary session also stressed that we should maintain a global vision. The Chinese people have always striven to pursue the vision of peace, amity, and harmony. We believe that China will do well only when the world does well, and vice versa. Since 1990, China has dispatched over 50,000 peacekeepers. China now is the second largest funding contributor to UN peacekeeping budget and has contributed more peacekeepers than any other members of the permanent members of the Security Council. Besides, China has provided over nearly 1.9 billion doses of COVID-19 vaccines for more than 120 countries and international organizations, making it the #1 contributor of vaccines to the rest of the world. China promises that it will strive to peak carbon dioxide emissions before 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. It will only take 30 years for China to leap from carbon peaking to carbon neutrality, much shorter than what might take many developed countries. Just as a Western saying goes, a man's actions shows his character. China, with its consistent, practical, and visible contributions, has proved to the world that it is a partner for win-win cooperation. China and Canada share extensive common interests and a broad space for cooperation in such areas as upholding multilateralism and free trade and tackling climate change. Thus, stronger coordination is needed for both sides. I'm looking forward to having candid, in-depth discussions with you today and would like to seek your advice on how we tackle the global issues in today's world. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for those opening remarks. In fact, Ambassador, you've hit on many of the themes that I think we will be touching on, including the last one, on what can Canada and China be doing better and differently. You mentioned two other things which are germane to our topic. One is China's record in poverty alleviation and the fact that it has pulled the most number of people the fastest out of poverty in the history of mankind in some ways, at least as we measure it. And second, that the arc of carbon emissions is more compressed in the case of China and indeed other late developers than has been the case historically. And so I'm sort of trying to put that all together for my opening question to you, which is that when I sort of see some of the speeches and statements that the Chinese leadership makes about its role in the global economy, I'm struck by how similar they are to the kinds of principles that the world has been sort of subscribing to since the end of World War II, in fact. And I'd say that would be about a focus on openness, not protection, support for macroeconomic cooperation, support for multilateralism, support for equity with developing countries. And yet I was struck by this quote from President Xi in one of his recent speeches, and the quote is, "No two leaves in the world are identical, and no histories, cultures, or social systems are the same." And so in the broadest terms, Ambassador, help us understand how China sees itself and its role in the global economy.
Thank you. I believe that in this age of globalization, we realize that no country, can tackle the transnational issues only by itself, because the interests of all the countries are closely intertwined. So actually, now we are doing our best to make contributions to peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific and beyond for the whole world. So first, China is a builder of world peace. As you can see, we have been committed to resolving differences through dialogue and consultation, and to the principle of non-interference in others' internal affairs. It has taken an active part in political resolution for so many international and regional hotspot issues, like the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula and the Iranian nuclear issue. So that's my first point. And secondly, China is also a contributor to global development. As you can see, after we have joined WTO, actually the growth has contributed nearly 30% in global growth on average over the past 2 decades. In addition, China is a defender of international order. We maintain that there is only one system in the world, and that is to say, the UN-centered international system, and only one order, and that is the international order based on international law. China believes that international affairs should be addressed through consultation by all of us, all the members of the international community. And China firmly opposes unilateralism, protectionism, and the bullying acts, which we have seen too much recently. As well, China is a provider of public goods. And when we are talking about public goods, provided by China, maybe the first thing, coming into our mind is the Belt and Road Initiative, which was put forward back in 2013 by President Xi. And according to a World Bank report, BRI projects could help lift 7.6 million people out of extreme poverty and 32 million people out of moderate poverty across the world by 2030. So you can see that we are not doing a lot of things for lifting our people out of poverty, but also by providing this kind of public good. Also, we can do something to help people in other parts of the world to get rid of poverty. So that's my observation. Thank you.
Okay. We will come to Belt and Road and other Chinese-led regional and global initiatives, but I want to sort of touch on something else you said, which is the recent, and by recent I assume you meant during the COVID era, surge in protectionism and so on that we have seen. And I wanted to ask you about the two things that most observers, myself included, would think we really need in the COVID era, especially for developing countries to pull out of this. One would be that developing countries' macroeconomic situations are not as healthy as they are in developed countries. And so debt relief is much more of an issue there. The G20 has sanctioned a sort of $650 billion SDR issue to alleviate some of that, but more could be done. So I wanted to know about China's position on debt relief, including through its initiatives. And second, on intellectual property. And you're a member of the WTO. The TRIPS waiver is a hot issue and a concerning one for many of us. If you could tell us what the Chinese position on both of those is, it would help us understand how China is part of the solution to COVID.
Thank you. Maybe to ask your question first, I like to give you some, broad picture. When it comes to the question, it's about the economic governance, and we believe that we should take a long-term perspective, improve the global economic governance systems and the rules, and make up for the relevant governance deficits. And in this context, President Xi not long ago proposed a global development initiative. Also, he emphasized on the importance to stay committed to development as a priority, and also to a people-centered approach, and also to openness and cooperation. As well, he emphasized the need to committed to benefits for all. That means that we should care about the special needs of developing countries. So here comes your question for the developing countries. I think that because China is still a developing country, even though, as you mentioned, we are now the second largest economy in the world after so many years of development. But for per capita GDP, we are still, just 1/6 of that of the United States. So we are still the biggest developing country in the world. And for other developing countries, we have the same feelings towards them as it comes to those issues confronted by them. And of course, you talked about the COVID-19 and debt problems. And certainly that's very important. And for us, we believe that we will do whatever we can to the best of our ability in this regard. So in line with the G20 consensus, China has fully implemented the G20 debt service suspension initiative for poorest countries. And the total debt service payments suspended amount to more than $1 billion, the largest among G20 members. And recently, President Xi Jinping, when he was addressing the opening session of a ministerial meeting for a forum on China-Africa cooperation, he emphasized that we will exempt African least developed countries from debt incurred in the form of interest-free Chinese government loans due by the end of 2021. China is also ready to channel African countries $10 billion from its share of the IMF's new allocation of special drawing rights. In addition, we have noted that China's non-official financial institutions have also taken debt service suspension actions in a comparable manner with reference to the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI, provisions, which is rare among G20 countries. And when it comes to the vaccination question about the IPR issue, first, also a broad picture of IPR situation in China. And here, China is doing a lot of things over the years to strengthen the IPR protection, not only because we are forced by other countries to do so, but nowadays it is our desire and intention to make sure that we will do everything possible to protect IPR. And why? Because China is now committed to developing the strategy of innovation to build China into a nation with innovation. So that's very important. So that's why over the years, we have taken a lot of steps to enforce IPR protection, like first to formulate those laws and the regulations. And secondly, to make sure that those laws and the regulations are strictly enforced. And we have set up a lot of IPR courts throughout the country to address this kind of violation cases. And through all those efforts, I think China now has a much better performance. And when it comes to the innovation, we are now the 12th in the world, in the whole, and up, a lot of points from previous years. So that's, I think international community has already come to recognize that. And when it comes to the vaccination, vaccines, the IPR issue, for us, we also have proposed the Global Vaccine Cooperation Action Initiative, which includes strengthening vaccine R&D cooperation and support vaccine companies in conducting joint R&D and production with developing countries, support the WTO in making an early decision on waiving intellectual property rights on COVID-19 vaccines, and encourage vaccine companies to transfer technology to developing countries. And again, when President Xi was addressing the forum on China-Africa cooperation, he put forward the idea that China will provide another 1 billion doses of vaccines to Africa, including 600 million doses as donation and 400 million doses to be provided through such means as joint production by Chinese companies and the relevant African countries. So we do hope that other countries will also echo our viewpoint and to make sure that we resolve the issue as soon as possible so we can help those developing countries in urgent need for the vaccination. Thank you.
So this is joint production, presumably in factories located in Africa. Would technology be shared as well? Because that, as you know, is a big sticking point with the Western pharma firms.
So our position is that to transfer, this kind of production and also the technology, to those countries in urgent need, that's our viewpoint. So I think it's important and imperative that all the sides come to the consensus, for that.
Okay. Let's move to another area where sort of technology interplays with global governance, and that's climate change, where many observers were struck by the fact that in Glasgow at COP26, there was a broad base of set of agreements, which some people feel didn't go far enough, but that's what it is. But then the US and China struck a separate bilateral agreement. That can be seen two ways. One is that these are the two major players who are setting an example for others to follow. The other way is that these are two major players who are bypassing a multilateral consensus. Help us understand the thinking behind the agreement and the agreement.
Climate change nowadays is a very, popular issue or hot issue, in the international community. And for China, we have done a lot of things over the past decades, to address the issue. President Xi, when he was working in the province in Zhejiang back in 2005, he mentioned that the lucid water and the large mountains are invaluable assets. So back then, even before he became the president of the People's Republic of China, he attached great importance to environmental protection and addressing issues like climate change. So also, just like intellectual property rights, it's not because other countries ask China to do so, but it is because China have come to realize the importance of coping with climate change. So that's the background. And I think that for climate change, no country can cope with that individually. So we need a lot of international collaboration. And that's why we have taken part in the Paris Agreement. That's very important. And unfortunately, the United States, exited from the Paris Agreement a few years ago, which had a very negative impact on the global cause, in fighting climate change. And nowadays, it pledges that we'll be coming back. So that is good. So that's why China and the United States reached and issued the joint Glasgow Declaration on enhancing climate action in the 2020s on the sidelines of the Glasgow Conference. But it by no means to show that China and the United States were intended to bypass all those international consensus. Rather, at the critical moment when the negotiations were in stalemate, China and the United States issued the joint declaration. Actually, it provided an important solution to bridging differences among various parties and contributed to the success of the conference. And of course, this shows once again that together, China and the United States can work on a lot of major international issues. So I think that is, the answer, to your question. And we like to see not only United States and China, but a lot more other countries, including Canada. You like to have this kind of coordination and cooperation, and to address the issue, to make sure that we will leave a better environment for our children and the grandchildren. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's move from the G2 to the G20, of which China is also obviously a member. What was China's assessment of this year's G20 summit?
G20, as you know, we believe it's a main forum of international economic cooperation, and it is playing a leading role in the global economic governance reform. And I think Canada, as the one of the founding members, for that, has always played a unique and important role in the G20. So as you mentioned, I was here first time, that was more than 20 years ago. I still recall that back in 2020, there was a meeting for G20. At that time, was still not summit yet. It was the ministerial meeting for finance ministers and the governors of central banks. So I was here as a staff member from the embassy to receive our delegation from China. And at that time, it's already a lot of anti-globalization protesters on the streets. So that there's a kind of protected areas for those delegation members. And one day, one important official of the delegation would like to go out to the bookstore. I accompanied him going outside, and we had to hide our badges inside our jacket to make sure that we will be not recognized by those protesters that we were the members of the delegation. And when we got back to the checkpoint, and we have to produce the badges once again. So I would like to use this story to suggest that actually Canada, it has played a very important role in the founding of the G20. And over the years, as you mentioned, actually it's from the ministers' meeting and then to the summit, and has done a lot of important things for international economic governance. So for this year, the theme is people, planet, and prosperity. And we believe that the G20 Rome Summit expressed the determination of the international community to unite, to overcome the epidemic, and revitalize the world economy. And all parties they generally believe that it is necessary to unite global efforts, promote global development to a new stage of balance, coordination, and tolerance, and speed up the implementation of the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. And President Xi put forward a 5-point proposal when he was attending the summit. And it includes working in solidarity to combat COVID-19, strengthening coordination to promote recovery, embracing inclusiveness to achieve common development, and pursue innovation, and finally, promote harmonious coexistence, and that is referring to climate change, things like that. So I think that all the members of G20, they have demonstrating once again that unity and solidarity is needed to cope with all those important transnational issues. Thank you.
Yeah. In fact, you're quite right. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin is generally seen as the one of, if not the founder, one of the founders of the G20. And dare I say, CIGI in its early years did a lot of work on what a G20 at the leaders level might look like, which reminds me, throughout this event, we're using the chat function to place bios and also to bring to your attention salient publications from CIGI on the topics that we're discussing. And I'd like to move, Ambassador, to something you've touched upon and I said I'd come back to, which is China's commitment to multilateralism, while at the same time breeding regional or China-based initiatives. And I'm thinking of, obviously, the BRI, which you mentioned. I'm thinking of RCEP, and I'm thinking of your Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB. They might be seen as distractions from multilateralism, or they could be seen as being complementary to multilateralism. And I'd like you to help us understand how you see the coexistence of these China-based initiatives with the broader multilateral framework which China also professes to be a big supporter of.
I think your question touches upon, on how to perceive multilateralism. We believe that supporting WTO, of course, is practicing multilateralism. And at the same time, our proposal for Belt and Road Initiative for AIIB, and you mentioned RCEP, also serve to promote multilateralism. The key, I believe, is to see whether the idea and the practice of these arrangements have really played a positive role in promoting multilateralism. We argue that reforming and improving the current international system does not mean overturning it and starting anew, but rather promoting its development in the direction of more just cooperation. So the Belt and Road Initiative and the AIIB initiative are both open, transparent, and inclusive. All parties are welcome to participate actively. And for BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, I can share you with some other figures. Now, currently, more than 170 countries and international organizations have signed documents of cooperation with China. So it's already become the largest platform for international cooperation. And actually, it has produced tangible benefits with those countries and regions taking part in the initiative. And we have enhanced coordination with the policy initiatives of relevant countries, such as the Master Plan on ASEAN connectivity and the Northern Powerhouse Initiative of the United Kingdom and the Amber Road Initiative of Poland. So I think this kind of initiative, is inclusive and open in nature. Certainly that will complement, those existing multilateral arrangements. However, building small circles in the name of multilateralism is in fact group politics, as it is demonstrated by the court and the AUKUS recently. Selective multilateralism is not the right choice. Our approach is open and inclusive in nature. So I hardly believe there's any conflicting nature between those regional arrangements and those multilateral arrangements. So that's my observation, for your question. Thank you.
Just a follow-up from something you said previously on this as well, which is that through BRI, China is making, as part of its response to COVID in developing countries, interest-free loans. And as you know, the BRI has often been accused of sort of having countries run up debt and then sort of capital projects, or in some cases land or sovereignty, is ceded to China as a result of that debt. When the BRI makes its loans, or when China makes its loans through the BRI initiative, are you looking at the macroeconomic conditions and the debt feasibility in a country before extending those loans? That seems to be an issue.
You know that when we are talking about this kind of cooperation, certainly it's not China imposing its ideas on relevant countries, but rather we sit down and have very candid and constructive dialogue and to work out all those important projects. And there's nothing like conditions, political or economic conditions to be, attached to those projects. And there's nothing like so-called debt trap, for those countries involved. For example, some people suggesting Sri Lanka is facing a problem of debt trap, but the Sri Lanka side itself has denied. So it's nothing like, China is trying to use this BRI initiative just to make profit for its own. But as I mentioned earlier, it helps for the creating jobs for those, countries involved, and also to make sure that there will be much more connectivity among the countries concerned. Because as you can see, we have built a lot of railways, a lot of roads, ports, airports, and that's important for those countries to have more access to the outside world so they can export their products abroad. And also it's conducive for the people, they're moving around in the region. So it's a great thing, for the people and the countries concerned, rather than bringing them pressure or those kinds of, debts to them. So I would like to suggest that China is doing things by, consultation and the negotiation on equal footing, and that's very important. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So a last question, which actually bridges to the third part of our event, which is a Q&A with our audience. And I'd like to ask you what the motivation is behind China's application to join the CPTPP. And second, related to that, what does that imply for discussions, if any, that Canada and China might be having on trade and investment accord?
China is a staunch advocate for trade liberalization and facilitation, and an important participant in cooperation and economic integration in the Asia-Pacific. So I think that when we officially applied for the membership of CPTPP, it demonstrates our commitment, and our firm resolve in opening up even wider to the outside and promoting regional economic cooperation. Because someone's arguing China is actually pedaling back when it comes to the reform and the opening process. It is not. As we have summarized in our plenary session recently, one of the important experience is to making new grounds, and certainly reform and opening up for the past 43 years is among them. So certainly we will doing a lot of things to proceed with our opening up process and joining CPTPP is one of them. And we believe that by joining CPTPP, it will help promote economic integration in the Asia Pacific and facilitate post-COVID economic recovery, trade development, and investment growth in the world. And some people, when I talk to them here, they are wondering, if China can meet the high standard of CPTPP. And my answer is that for China, our practice is that whenever we commit to do something, we will do our best to make sure that we will be delivering on the pledge. Take WTO again as an example. 20 years ago, people were wondering after China's joining WTO whether China can follow all those regulations. So actually, in fact, when you see here today, the tariff rate for China, now it's 7.4%. And that was well below the 9.8%. That is the target for the tariff rate. When we mentioned that we will lower down the tariff rate. Before joining WTO, it was like 15.3%. So now it's 7.4%, well below our 9.8% pledge. So you can see that we can do all the things that to the best of our ability to make sure that we will honor our commitment. So if China is included in the CPTPP, that will be good news for all the 11 members of CPTPP, currently 11 members. Currently, the CPTPP members, their GDP share in the world is like 13%. And if China is included, it will be increased to 30%. So that means huge opportunities for Canada and all the other members of CPTPP. And when it comes to those negotiations, China certainly will follow relevant procedures of the CPTPP to conduct necessary consultations with all the members of CPTPP, and that includes Canada as well. So that's a process, and we will be working on that with relevant members of CPTPP. Thank you.
I take it then that the CPTPP negotiations take precedence over anything bilateral with Canada.
You know that we follow the relevant rules and regulations, and at the same time, we will work out with each and every member of CPTPP just to see how we move ahead with that. So for Canada, we would like to be engaged in all those relevant dialogues.
Okay, so thank you for that. So now I'll sort of move from this screen to this screen. People have been sending in their questions, and what I'm going to try and do is summarize them and ask the sense of what they are. And there's a couple of questions on the screen which connect with a lot of what you and I have just been talking about. It's from a colleague at the CBC, but it reflects the gist of many other questions that have come in, which is, what are the main challenges that Canada and China face in their relationship? And the two specific examples would be, obviously, what would it mean for our relations with China if Huawei's 5G technology was in some ways banned in this country from its infrastructure? And second, what if Canada went the way of the US as it announced yesterday and announced a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics? In other words, how do the politics, technology, and broader international relations interact, in your view, between our two countries?
First, maybe I would like to touch upon the general question of our bilateral relationship. I think that for China and Canada, sound and steady development of the relationship is in the interest of our two peoples, because in the past 51 years since the establishment of our diplomatic relations, many facts have shown that actually, the relationship it has produced tangible benefits to our two peoples. Like our trade volume was almost 500 times bigger than it was in the early 1970s. So I would like to argue that currently, in this age of globalization, the cooperation areas for that between our two countries is expanding, rather than shrinking. So we have the traditional areas for cooperation, like trade and investment, like people-to-people exchange. But also, more importantly, I think China and Canada can do a lot of things together on tackling issues like climate change, pandemic, and sustainable development. And also, I would like to suggest, because you asked about the biggest problem in our bilateral relationship, and I think that currently we have to make sure that the principle of mutual respect and equal treatment is gaining more prominence, in this age, because over the past 3 years, it has been proven, once again by the Mengwanzhou incident. Anything that undermining the principle will actually make our relationship suffer, and to witness setback. So it is hoped that the lessons will be learned, and also we stick to the mutual respect and equal treatment. Of course, there are other sensitive issues that we have to handle very carefully, like the Taiwan question. So the One China principle is a political foundation for our bilateral relationship. So it is hoped that the Canadian side will continue to honor the One China principle, and to make sure that we will not be engaged in any official contacts with Taiwan. And you mentioned the Huawei 5G. I think people should perceive that not only to see that as a business, issue, because first it's as a business issue, but secondly, I would like to suggest someone trying to politicize the issue and to try to abuse and overstretch the concept of national security, and that is not conducive for people doing business here in Canada. That will be sending out a very wrong signal to the Chinese companies, but to the companies of other countries as well. Because for Huawei, I'm not promoting Huawei product here. It's a private company. I would just like to use some facts to suggest that Huawei has cooperation with more than 170 countries and regions in the world. And none of them have ever come forward with any suggestion that it has concrete evidence to see that Huawei's products are of security threat to them. So it is, invented by the United States. And the main purpose for that is to crack down on Huawei, just as the Mengwanzhou incident was. And for the United States, this kind of ploy and intention, people have think through that very clearly, not for Huawei, but for other high-tech products of China. So here, we do hope that the Canadian side will make their judgment on its own, and not to be listening to the opinion from the United States, and to provide just, fair, open, and non-discriminatory business environment to the Chinese investors and companies. And for the Winter Olympic Games, as you mentioned, I think that is actually we should see the first. The sports is sports. It should not be politicized. But it is sad to see, that the United States is trying to make the issue for their political gains. It has a lot of political intention, and it seriously violates the charter of the Olympics. And it is actually invited a lot of opposition and criticism from around the world. So I do hope that people, especially in the age of globalization, and we are confronting with all those transnational issues, first, we should make sure that the Winter Olympic Games is a venue for the athletes all over the world to compete. And also, secondly, it's a time for the humankind to show their resilience during this trying time to tackle all those transnational issues. And those athletes and the winter sports lovers should not be deprived of the rights, to have this wonderful event once in 4 years' time. And for the United States, actually, no one cares about whether they will be there, their officials will be there or not, because no invitation is sent to them. And I believe that with the concerted efforts of all the parties concerned, we will certainly to host a streamlined, splendid, and safe Winter Olympic Games in Beijing. And all the countries, the athletes from them, will have a wonderful performance in Beijing, including those from Canada, including those from the United States. Thank you.
So back to Huawei and technology for just a bit. There are a lot of countries that have concerns about that technology, and it's not necessarily because they're just listening to what the US is telling them to do. I have no insights into Canadian decision-making in this regard, but I suspect we have our own agencies looking into these issues. I know you're representing your country, but do you understand why other countries might have concerns about Huawei technology, whether it's because of backdoor or whether it's because of the pervasive nature of surveillance in China? Do you see where other countries are coming from when they express doubts about Huawei technology?
You talked about, some countries, are having this kind of suspicion, over Huawei's products, but just very, very few countries indeed in the whole world. And you can see a lot more countries, they would like to have this continued cooperation with Huawei. So China, we don't do this kind of things of, spying or electronic monitoring. It is the United States who have been, doing this kind of things over the past decades, even, monitoring its allies, the leaders of its allies. So that is the biggest threat to the world. And for China, there's nothing like that. So I think that for some certain people or certain countries, they would like to doing things that is like abusing and overstretching the concept of national security. It's not based on business factors, but rather than on those political factors. So that's why I'm emphasizing the need for Canada and other countries to provide non-discriminatory and fair and just business environment to Chinese companies, not only Huawei, but other companies as well. Thank you.
There's a question on climate change, and it connects with something you said previously about what Canada and China might be doing together in areas where they do agree. China's commitment is to carbon neutrality by 2060. Canada has also made significant commitments to GHG emissions. You alluded to the fact that Canada and China could work together jointly to alleviate some of the issues with climate change. Could you expand on that?
Of course, I've noted that here in Canada, people are talking a lot about climate change, and the government is rolling out a number of initiatives in this regard. Certainly, it's good. Any policy, any initiative conducive towards coping with climate change, I believe, should be welcome. And China and Canada are both parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and its Paris Agreement. And both sides have the same position in addressing global climate change. Both China and Canada have announced the goal of achieving net zero emissions. So really, I believe that we have a broad prospect in this regard because Canada has advantages, unique advantages, I would say, in clean energy technologies, including hydrogen energy and the carbon capture. And China has a large market demand in related areas. So I believe there's a great potential for our two countries, in the coming years. And for our 14th five-year plan, this year is the first year for that. We have emphasized a lot on making sure that our economy will be transitioning toward a green, low carbon, and circular economy. So I think that we have all those kind of areas, markets opening for the Canadian business people, in relevant fields. So that's, my thoughts, on that. Thank you.
Yeah. There's a question on people-to-people ties. There is a large community of Canadians who originally came from China. Does the existence of this community enhance the relationship between the two countries, or do you think it's neutral or something else?
People-to-people exchange are very important. It's an important part of our relationship. And also, we have a large community here. I think it's like a tie, a bridge, between our two countries, which help deepening mutual understanding between our two sides. And that's very important. And also you can see that a lot of Chinese students are here. Before COVID-19, it was like more than 200,000 students studying here in Canada. And after COVID-19, a little bit smaller number, but still a lot of people, students coming back this fall semester, to be on campus. And some of the new students are also excited to be here. And I think that's wonderful. And we do encourage a lot more Canadian students to visit China as well, because that's very important for deepening mutual understanding between our two sides. Because here, so many people, they haven't been to China in the past. So they are easily misled by those reports and the coverage about China. But if they have been to China, I've talked to a lot of people, if they have been to China, the most of those people, they would have a fairly objective reading of what China looks like and the significance of the bilateral relationship between our two sides. So I do hope that we will see more people exchange in the coming years.
I should say, as someone who came to Canada as a foreign student, that foreign students give vibrancy to universities and to college life and campus life in ways that very few other things do. There's a question on the Summit for Democracy. In fact, I think in your opening remarks you called it the so-called Summit for Democracy. And so I can guess what the views might be, but help us understand why a meeting of like-minded countries who share certain values that we've come to call democratic is something that you appear to see with skepticism.
First, we would like to ask who gives the United States the right to determine which country is democratic or not. Because if you are doing things just based on one particular system, that in itself is undemocratic. Because there are so many systems for democracy around the world. And certainly the United States is in no position to judge whether a country is democratic or not. And for China, we enjoy what we call the whole process, people's democracy. That has been developed over the years since the founding of the new China. And it works. It works because it is suited to our national condition and supported by the people. So people have their voices being heard at the key juncture for those policy makings. For example, I just mentioned the 14th five-year plan, and a lot of people here also have shown a great interest in the 14th five-year plan because it provides them with the opportunities for further developing cooperation with China. So last year, when the 14th five-year plan was in the process of being formulated, President Xi himself went to different parts of China and held a lot of meetings to listen to the people's opinions. And also we have put the draft online, and altogether more than 1 million pieces of suggestions had been put forward. And we have sorted out those important suggestions and incorporated them into the final draft. So it demonstrates that we do have our ways of doing things. But for the United States, it claims it is a democratic country. But even for the people within the United States, they are actually believing the democracy in the United States is seriously undermined. And according to a survey done by a United States institution, more than 80% of American people now believe that the serious threat to the American democracy comes from within the United States. And we believe for those slogans, when the campaigns are being held, actually all those slogans, campaign slogans, can they also be implemented later on? It's not the case. Still, we believe democracy is not an ornament, for decoration, but it is really, to make sure people will enjoy the real democracy. Not only like 4 years of time, they will be, listening to those slogans, by certain politicians. And for those human rights record, in the United States, it's just horrible. And you can see each year there are around 500,000 people, being used as forced labor in the United States. So for this kind of country, how can it claim it has democracy and human rights? And the practice of the United States drawing things according to ideology certainly will create division and confrontation among members of the international community. And it's dangerous. It's like the new version of Cold War. And hardly, it will be popular among the international, the members of the international community, but rather it will bring this kind of chaotic thing to the international community. Actually, currently, solidarity and unity is needed more than ever for us to combat pandemic and other very important issues which have a great bearing on humankind. So that's my observation. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, to be fair to this summit, one of the agenda items is internal threats to democracy. So I think the US and other attendees are live to the fact that not all threats to democracy come from outside, and that is one of the goals of the summit. But it does lead to the obvious question, even though this event was on sort of global economics, since you mentioned human rights and sort of different approaches to it, and as a scholar, I do understand that some countries can privilege collective rights and others can privilege individual rights, and that's one of those discussions that is had. But it does raise the question of Xinjiang and what's happening there. And there seem to be two views. A lot of countries, especially in the West, believe that what's happening there is, to use the term, genocide, that there is a cultural oppression going on based on technological and other prowess that the authorities use. And presumably China has a different take on that. Help us understand why the view that technology is being used to isolate minorities is wrong.
First, there's nothing like genocide happening in Xinjiang. It's a lie of the century, as we call it, because when you see the latest figure for Xinjiang, the population for the Uyghur ethnic group, it has increased between 2010 and 2020 by 16.2%. So is there anything like genocide like that? A 16% increase in a 10 years time span. And all the people from different ethnic groups are living in harmony, and they enjoying, happy lives, and also the harmony among different ethnic groups. And there's nothing like cultural genocide happening in Xinjiang, because we have taken all those measures needed to protect the freedom of religious belief. And in Xinjiang, we have more than 24,000 mosques, and that means on average, one for 530 Muslims in Xinjiang. It's a very big ratio indeed. And as well, there's no forced labor. People there of all the ethnic groups, when they are coming to choose the occupation, they have their own right to do so. And there's very different from what some people in the West they have claimed. For those people, they are also doing things out of their political intention. They don't really care about human rights in Xinjiang or elsewhere in China. What they would like to do is try to disrupt the development of Xinjiang and of China. But certainly their attempts will be doomed to failure. And when we are talking about the voices of the international community, you mentioned a lot of countries, but actually it's just a small number of Western countries. And in all those important venues, like the UN Geneva Human Rights Council or the Third Committee in New York in recent years, close to 100 countries, they have expressed their opposition to a certain number of Western countries using Xinjiang issue and other issues in China to intervene in the domestic politics of China. And they have urged the United States and some other Western countries to stop this practice. And all those people who have been to Xinjiang, from the end of 2018, I think close to 2,000 of them, different countries, more than 100 of them, and they composed of diplomats, journalists, the representatives of religious groups. After they went to Xinjiang and they came back with the impression that people there are living in harmony. And that's very important because there's a first-hand impression. And for those things like we are trying to isolate the ethnic minorities, it's not like that. Nothing like that happening in Xinjiang. As I mentioned, the people are living in happiness and harmony. So it's a lie, concocted by the United States and some certain Western countries. And the purpose is trying to contain China's development and the Xinjiang's development. Thank you.
So the reports of forced labor, of the re-education camps effectively being prisons, the official view is that this is all a lie and based on an envy or a desire to impede China's development?
Those are lies, and we would call it lies of the century because, there's nothing like forced labor or genocide, or as you mentioned, those camps. For those, they are actually vocational educational schools. And for those people who were, radicalized by those extremist thinking. And we make sure that those people, they learn laws, regulations, and certain skills, when they were in the school. And after they graduate, with the help of the local governments, they all found decent jobs. And that's very important to make sure that they will be living happily, in the society and to enjoy, this kind of very good relationship with their family members, with their friends, and in the community. So it's a great practice for deradicalization. And it's nothing different from those in United Kingdom and France. They also have this kind of deradicalization centers. So basically, the nature is similar. Thank you.
Okay. There's a question on artificial intelligence, and my prelude to it would be that China and the US, if you measure prowess by the number of patents held, hold over 90% of patents in AI. And in fact, China has now surpassed the US in filing AI patents. And even if you assume that some of them are not of high quality, it's still a very, very impressive figure. AI is largely seen as the economic, political, and social sort of technology of the future, if not already being upon us. Could you give us a sense of why China places this emphasis on AI and what kinds of uses you see for it for your own development and that of the world?
First, I would like to recognize, the contribution on the part of CIGI, over the years, for exploring, the ways forward for global governance and also to deal with these new issues of AI. You really, are the pioneering, in this kind of field when it touches upon the global governance. And for us, because I mentioned earlier that now we are building China into a country, with innovation. Certainly, we also are demonstrating a great interest in AI and anything that is of those kind of new technology. And we would like to see that they can be benefiting the people while we are moving down the process of modernization. And we would like to have this very good exchange with other countries. So we believe that on the one hand, we should give full play to the potential of new technologies and the artificial intelligence help economic and social development and better benefit all mankind. And also on the other hand, we should also strengthen foresight and the risk awareness. No wonder, because as a new technology, there's a risks to guide the correct development direction of AI and to ensure its safety, reliability, and controllability. We believe that it is necessary to comprehensively and thoroughly study the impact and the challenges of AI on employment, personal privacy, morality, and ethics, and attach importance to protecting the legitimate rights and interests of vulnerable groups. And in addition, we believe that we should create a favorable environment for openness and cooperation when it comes to AI. And also, we believe that we should adhere to inclusive and fair rulemaking, and that's very important. The discussion and the formulations of relevant rules should adhere to the principle of wide consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefit, and be carried out on the broadly representative platforms such as the United Nations and the G20. So that's my points to share with you. Thank you.
In fact, I meant to ask you about that. The OECD has developed a set of principles on the ethical use of AI. The G20 has, in fact, adapted them. We talk a lot about, the US and China, or the West and China, not having common values. And I'm trying to understand whether the entry point of the ethics of AI, in your view, will be an example where we will show that these two systems can work together, or will this be another one of those cleavages where we have fundamentally different views of how technology affects society?
If we, doing things, when it comes to AI or other kinds of new technology, I think it is very important to respect the sovereignty and the laws and the regulations of all the countries concerned. On the basis of that, if we can, doing things, like sitting down and having, candid exchange of views, to make sure that it's an open-minded and inclusive process. I believe that there are chances that we can make it, something that we will make sure that we will be working closer rather than dividing us. But if the United States wants to impose some of its ideas and its rules on others, like it has done, over the years, it will be becoming more dangerous, and possibly will create, the divisions among the countries. So I would like to argue for that from the very beginning, when we are talking about these important issues like AI. we should address them with the right approach and on the basis of mutual respect and win-win cooperation. Thank you.
And so we have time for one last question before we move to the wrap-up section of our conversation, Ambassador. And it's a fitting way to, I guess, to end this segment. It's the U.S. and China, the question says, are in a great competition. Some of us would argue that the winner-take-all nature of technology also leads to that. And yet we need both countries for the world to be a better place. What is your prognosis for U.S.-China relations in the next few years?
When we are talking about U.S.-China relationship in the next few years, maybe we should first reflect on what has happened, for the past few decades. And I believe that the most important thing, happening in international relations over the past 50 years is the reopening of the China-U.S. relationship and the development of the China-U.S. relationship ever since, because this year marks, the ping-pong diplomacy, 50 years of that, and Dr. Kissinger's secret trip, to China back in the summer 1971. Over the past 5 decades, a lot of things have changed, but one thing remains the same. That is the experience we have drawn from the past 50 years for our bilateral relationship, is that China and the United States stand to gain from cooperation and to lose from confrontation. So our message is that looking ahead for the next 50 years, maybe the most important thing in the international relations will be if China and the United States can get along with each other. And our message is that we should pursue mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. And that's very important because for China and the United States, the two largest economies in the world, we can do a lot of things together. But also, if we don't cooperate, not only us will be suffering from that, but all the other rest of the world will also see, those, costs, because a lot of things maybe they cannot be resolved perfectly without the cooperation between our two sides. So I think it is important for the United States to discard the new Cold War mentality. It has said that it won't be engaged in a new Cold War, but we would like to see that it will really honor its commitment to translating their words into action and not to be engaged in those kind of things, like say when it comes to the Winter Olympic Games. It actually will have a bad impact on the cooperation and exchange between our two countries in a lot of areas. So we do hope the United States, they will come to know the importance of our bilateral relationship and really demonstrate the willingness and the sincerity to be engaged in this kind of dialogue, exchange, and cooperation on the basis of mutual respect and equality. And there's a lot more that we can explore in the coming years, a lot more areas, bilaterally and multilaterally. So maybe it's a very big question that I can spend, 3 hours, talking about that. But because of the time limit, I just want to share with you some of the my views, on that. Thank you.
Sure. Very good. In that case, this leads us to the final segment in which, Ambassador, I'd like you to spend 2 or 3 minutes just summing up on what we've discussed. We went, we had a very broad and sometimes deep discussion on various issues. Do you have any sort of concluding thoughts based on what you heard?
Yeah, actually, this conversation inspired me a lot. And I think we have covered a wide range of issues, and they can all be reflected in the name of Center for International Governance Innovation, CIGI. The first is international. The rampant pandemic reminds us once again that no country is able to tackle so many common challenges to humanity on its own. There is a need for the international community to embrace an international vision, build international consensus, conduct international cooperation, and carry out international actions, thus jointly addressing international challenges that keep emerging. Any attempt to implement the Me First policy or go it alone will lead nowhere. All countries should regard taking part in world affairs as their own duty and actively take actions rather than being onlookers. The second is governance. In face of intricate and complex global problems, international governance should be based on the rules and consensus reached by international community. Without international law and rules that are formed and recognized by the global community, the road may fall back to the law of the jungle, and the consequences would be devastating for humanity. We need to firmly uphold the international system centered on the United Nations, the international order underpinned by international law, and practice true multilateralism. The third is innovation. The world is undergoing changes unseen in a century. To uphold multilateralism in the 21st century, we should promote its fine tradition, take on new perspectives, and look to the future. We need to stand by the core values and the basic principles of multilateralism. We also need to adapt to the changing international landscape and respond to global challenges as they arise. We need to reform and improve the global governance system on the basis of extensive consultation and consensus building. So in closing, I wish to express my appreciation once again for CIGI and President Medhora yourself for hosting today's event. And I'm looking forward to more of this kind of discussion in the near future. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you. For my part, I guess I would say thank you for having joined us and for having given us perspectives we might not always agree with them, but to hear them coming from you is important. And so thank you for that. I was struck, although I've always known this, but when I do events like this, for my part, I was struck by how intertwined are economy, society, culture, politics, and technology. And so what I thought would be a discussion on China and the global economy inevitably got into questions of human rights and different approaches to democracy or lack thereof. I also take absolutely at word what the ambassador said, that if the US and China more broadly don't cooperate, then the rest of the world cannot be a better place either. And so it's in everyone's interest to have that relationship work. And it's absolutely almost the duty of those two countries to have that relationship work. So with those sort of brief remarks, thank you again, Ambassador, for joining. And yes, I hope we can do this again in some form. Reminder to the audience that if you wish to sign up for other CIGI events or the Tuesday morning CIGI bulletin, then you can sign up for it by going to our website and registering, and we will be happy to serve you continuously thereafter. And I look forward to seeing you at yet another virtual or in-person event at some point in future. Thank you again.